She had Bonanza Days, and her job was to stand by the front door and hand out these promotional yardsticks. And so we all had her duties. Happily, my duty was to hand out little cups of Mountain Dew. And believe me, I took advantage of my position. By the end of the day, I was buzzing on Mountain Dew.
Thank you all for being here. Beth, thank you for coming out, and we're all excited and looking forward to hearing a little bit more. So welcome Beth DeCarbo, author of Mom and Pop Hardware.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. First of all, it is great to be back in Lawrence, where I was forged into a Jayhawk almost 40 years ago. I am originally from McPherson, and I have some McPhersonites who are here, woohoo, who are in person today, so thank you. So almost 40 years ago, I was the only person from my graduating class who attended KU that year. So I drove to campus by myself. And when I got to the hill where my dorm was located, I was overwhelmed that the population of those dorms, just those buildings, was greater than the population of my entire hometown. And I pulled up in front of the dorms and I unloaded my things into my room. And when I came back out to my car, I saw the tow truck pulling away with my car. I didn't realize, I can't park in front of the dorm. And I chased it down and I gave him $20 to unhitch my car. And I was a little rattled, and I parked my car and got back to my room, and the door was locked.
Welcome to Lawrence.
And I didn't realize that when you shut your dorm room, it locked behind you, because we never locked our doors in McPherson. That I was stunned and had to go to the desk and ask for another key. And they explained, no, your door locks, that you have to lock your door. So then I got back into my room and I called my mother, and I had a nice boo-hoo with her because my car had been towed. And then I locked myself out of my room. And after I finally got myself put back together, I went to the cafeteria to have some dinner, and the cafeteria was closed. I had missed the dinner hour. So then I had another good boo-hoo after that. So needless to say, it was a it was a tough first day for the hayseed from McPherson. Perhaps or perhaps not, you know by now the story of my folks' hardware stores. They were competing hardware stores, and they were located right next door to each other on Main Street in McPherson. I wish I could say that they were these cute little shops with striped awnings and gold lettering on plate glass windows, but instead they were these low-slung stucco buildings with flat roofs that had to be shoveled anytime there was a heavy snowfall. The buildings looked very similar on the outside, but on the inside, they were starkly different. My dad's store catered to farmers, oil fields, and light industry. In addition to hardware, there was an auto parts counter and a steel shop. There was a lot of merchandise, and the displays were very utilitarian. Here are shovels and pitchforks, rope. This is the enormous bolt room. It had all kinds of fasteners. These are just wood screws. This whole wall of little wood bins, it's just wood screws. My mother's store was much different. That's my mom, who's on the left. Hers was much smaller and employed 2 part-time clerks. In addition to hardware, my mom sold gifts and housewares. But people could rent carpet cleaners and a 5-gallon ice cream maker for ice cream socials or family reunions. And next to the cash register, you can kind of see it there, was a candy case. And customers often would come and buy just one piece of chocolate, and they would eat it off the piece of wax paper, and they would stand there and chat with my mother. And that's because she was a very good listener. And it was a social thing just to go and eat chocolate and visit with my mom. That is one of the display cases with the Pyrex dinnerware, glassware, which is now vintage. Like, it's worth a lot of money when, who knew it was just glassware at the time. So all of this was displayed in this beautiful antique oak cabinetry that came from an old hardware store that my parents had purchased. Here are the hand tools and power tools. Many of the cases had merchandise mounted on orange felt boards. Do you see those in the background? And the clerk would, the customer would point to what they wanted on the board, so you see some padlocks on there. And then the clerk would open up the adjacent cabinet and then pull the item out of a drawer. And the customer would look at it and decide if they wanted it. It is not an efficient way to sell hardware. You had to have a clerk, and you're looking at items one by one that had to be pulled out of a drawer. So it was a beautiful right, but you really couldn't sell hardware that way today. So below, do you see that cash register? Below, those were bins full of nails, and the nails were raked into a scale and weighed however much you wanted, and then they were put onto brown paper and then wrapped and tied with a string. So they were sold in bulk. That the thought of buying bolts or screws or nails in a plastic package would be ridiculous. Like, I can't imagine selling that in a plastic package. So these are the bins with, you see the scale in the background, and those are the bins with the bolts, and those are mainly carriage bolts and hex head cap screws. Mom's store came to Main Street first, and I was in the 2nd grade. And after school, I was expected to hang out there until closing time. Basically, I goofed off with my brother Ricky and my sister Karen. My father at the time owned a junkyard on the outskirts of town, and he sold it and eventually opened a hardware store right next door to my mother's hardware store. And that gave me and Ricky and Karen even more space to goof off. So to help you understand this dynamic, this is me and Ricky and Karen. I'd like to call your attention to Ricky. Man, was he fun. We built forts using boxes in the freight room. We had water fights in the bolt room. We played hide and seek with nails. And more than once, Ricky made me laugh so hard that Mountain Dew squirted out of my nose. In short, Ricky, Karen, and I tore up the stores and disrupted business. One day, my dad had had enough, and he blew up. He could be kind of a screamer, and we learned that you had to kind of squint your eyes like that to keep the spittle from getting in your eyes when he was screaming. But his message to us was firm. The fun is over, and you have to go to work. My job was to fill the peanut. There was a peanut warmer, and the old geezers would come and hang out and hang out there for the free coffee. And I also had to sweep the floor because the floor filled up with the peanut shells that the old geezers threw onto the floor when they were done eating the peanuts. The thought of putting them in the trash can didn't even occur to them. But in time, I was expected to help out the customers if my dad was short-handed. And that's when my eyes were opened. I looked at all those bins and shelves and drawers, and I realized that, wow, hardware is really complicated. I didn't know a thing about it. So I'm going to read a very brief excerpt from the book, and it kind of gives you a sense of what I felt like I was facing. To me, it seemed like everything my parents stocked, rope, drill bits, saw blades, wrenches, files, hinges, nails, gloves, pipe fittings, power drills, and shovels, came in a multitude of variations, and none of it made sense. Why is 10-gauge wire bigger around than 14-gauge wire, while a number 10 screw is smaller around than a number 14 screw? And it's downright shocking to me how humble bolts and mere screws can come in so many variations. For starters, there are wood screws, sheet metal screws, machine screws, and lag screws. The top of the screw comes in multiple shapes, such as a flathead, round head, pan head, and hex head. And depending on the screwdriver used, the head can have a slotted groove, a cross grooves, and an opening for a hex key. Bolts also come in a variety of flavors: plain and galvanized, coarse thread, or fine thread. Two bolts could be the exact same size, but one could have a harder metal than the other, which you could tell by the number of hash marks on the head. Nuts and washers also come in a dizzying array of sizes and types. It took time, but eventually I became so familiar with bolts and screws that I could usually identify their type, length, diameter, head style, and hardness just by looking at them. The secret? Name that bolt. It's a game that Ricky invented. My brother would hold up a bolt or screw. The more obscure, the better, and I would have to guess. Number 14 by 4, slotted flathead wood screw. Wrong. Number 12. Here's one for Karen. And Karen would say, 5/16 by 2, grade 5, national fine, hex head cap screw, she would say. Correct! Ding, ding, ding! The more we tried to stump each other, the better we got at the guessing game. As expected, Ricky usually won the most points in Name That Bolt, even when I slipped in an occasional metric bolt, which is measured in millimeters. It's a good thing we didn't play for money. I thought it would be a fun exercise to play a mini version of Name That Bolt here today. This won't be exactly the same because there's no way to look at this slide and know if this is a 1/4 inch or a 5/16 inch bolt. So we'll just talk about types, okay? Okay. Anybody know what this is? Anybody?
A round head.
No, it is a carriage bolt. And it seems like it's kind of a dated name, an antiquated name, since we don't ride in carriages anymore. And I feel like it should have a more modern name, just like we shouldn't say things are operated from horsepower anymore, because nobody knows how many horses it would take to pull a car or to run a drill. Like somebody says something's 2,000 horsepower. I don't think I could even visualize 2,000 horses, let alone how much 2,000 horses could pull. Okay. What's this? What's this?
That one's a hex bolt.
Hex head.
Yeah, hex head bolt. This is what I think of when I think of a bolt. Technically, it's called a hex head cap screw, but calling it a screw seems counterintuitive because when I think of a screw, I think of it having that pointy tip. This is a grade 5 bolt, which you can tell because by looking at the head, it has those 3 hash marks. So when you look at a bolt, you add 2 to the hash marks, and that tells you the hardness of the bolt. So this is a grade 5 bolt. You have 3 hash marks plus 2 is a grade 5. And so that's a pretty hard bolt. So fun fact, once a year, the carnival came to town, and they'd have all these crazy rides. And the rides inevitably would break down, and the carnies would come to my dad's store to buy the pieces, the parts and pieces to fix the rides. And they would always buy grade 2 bolts, which are the softest bolts available. And I would say to them, for just a few cents more, you could buy the grade 5 bolts, which are harder. And the carnies would be like, nah, we'll just get the grade 2 bolts. And I never went on those rides again. Like, I'm not going to do it, because if they're going to cheap out on the bolts, what else are they skimping on? Like, come on. These are people's lives at stake. But anyway, the ride, no one ever died on the rides, but I just thought, okay. So there are a few of these. What's that? This is a pretty obvious one. It's a wood screw, which is probably the most common kind of screw, but what kind of head is that? It's a Phillips screw. Okay, Okay, here I have a prize. You'll get to choose. Who is the Phillips head wood screw named after? The Phillips head wood screw.
John Philip Sousa.
One would think the inventor would be named Phillips, but that is wrong, however. The person who invented the Phillips head wood screw is named Thomson, right? It's crazy. And for whatever reason, it will remain lost into history. He sold, Mr. Thomson invented it. It was a great invention because for the first time, screws could be driven in straight as opposed to a slotted screw. And it really sped up assembly lines because it just made driving in screws much faster. But he sold his patent to a guy named Phillips, who then just licensed it to screw manufacturers and just collected the royalties. So Phillips was basically a paper pusher, and Thomson is the guy who came up with the Phillips head screw and the driver to drive it in. So poor guy. Next, what's that? The threads go all the way to the top. That's a sheet metal screw, also with a Phillips head. That is a cap screw because an Allen wrench goes into it. Trick question. It's a lag screw, but it also is called a lag bolt. So even though it has that pointy little tip on it, a lot of people call it a lag bolt. Okay, are we learning a lot? See, it's educational, huh? Okay. Okay. What's this? What kind of file? Of course it's a file. What kind of file?
Fingernail.
No, so it's about this long. No, it's called a bastard file. A bastard file. Now, why is it called a bastard file? What makes it a bastard file? It's when two files have sex out of wedlock. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's an intermediate. Bastard means intermediate. That it's not exactly a fine file, and it's not a coarse file that would remove a lot of the material. It's somewhere in between. And so bastard means intermediate, or it's irregular. And I didn't know when I was a kid that was a naughty word. And if I did know that it was a naughty word, I would be scolded if I were to laugh or smirk or anything like that, because that would be disrespectful to the customer if I made it seem vulgar somehow. And you always treated the customers with respect. If I were to laugh or smirk, I would either be scolded and told to apologize, or be told to apologize and sent home. Ricky saw that as a challenge, because there are a lot of things in a hardware store that made me laugh. So with a straight face and a flat voice, Ricky would say to me, "Bethy, could you tell the customer that we're out of butt hinges?" Now, to a little kid, it was very funny. And I know it's juvenile, but I was a juvenile. And so I would have to keep a straight face. And then Ricky would go, "Bethy, could you help this man find some tongue oil?" And I would like, "Of course I will." And then to make it worse, Ricky would say, "Yeah, we keep it right next to the navel jelly." So he would do his very best to make me laugh and get yelled at. I would have to apologize, and if I really couldn't keep it together, I would get sent home. And on my way out the door, Ricky would have to chime in, "Bethy, try to be a little more professional next time," just to rub it in a little bit. It was actually Ricky who told me how babies were made. He used the words man parts and lady parts, but when he told me, well, it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard in my life. So I ran across the parking lot to my mother's store, and when she finished up with her customer, I told her Ricky's version of how babies were made, using the words man parts and lady parts. Lo and behold, my mother said Ricky was right. I couldn't believe it. But rather than give a long, windy explanation with the explicit yet correct words like vagina and penis, my mother, the hardware store owner, merely gave me a visual demonstration. I'm going to let this slide just sink in for a moment. That's how I learned the facts of life. Seriously, really? So that's me as a high school senior. I have no idea what's going through my mind while that picture was being taken. I was probably worried about my hair or my skin at the moment, but here's the big picture. The stores were doing okay, but money was pretty tight. There was the grain embargo a few years earlier. There had been fuel shortages because of OPEC. There had been double-digit interest rates that made paying loans very, very difficult. My mother had cancer, but it seemed like she was making progress and responding to treatment, but it was still very uncertain. I was happy in McPherson, but I wondered what else was out there. It was going to be tough to afford college, so everything felt very uncertain. So let's just fast forward to today. If I could go back to my younger self, and I want you to think about this because I'm going to ask you to go back to your younger selves, what would I tell Bethy, who's a senior in high school? First, I would tell her to dial it back on the Mountain Dew a little bit. Like, not quite so much Mountain Dew. But I would want her to know that people who come from small towns can achieve just as much as folks who come from big cities. And that grads from state schools are just as good as grads from the Ivies, because it all comes down to the quality of the work. And that it's important to know how to fix things, or at least try to fix things. And that Dad was right. You treat people with respect, no matter what they look like, or how much money they have, what car they drive, what clothes they wear. And most important, I would tell her that the years ahead won't always be easy, but that it's going to be okay. And that someday you're going to look back on your childhood in Kansas and realize that you grew up in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Thank you. If you want to turn the lights on, I will take any questions. Sandra will be here to sell books, but you don't have to buy a book. You really don't have to buy a book. But do you have any questions? Or if not, I would like to ask if anybody would like to share, if you were a senior in high school and you could go back in time and say something to that younger self, what would you say to that person?
This is not about that, but would your dad have been a kind of person that gave credit to people and had if they couldn't pay, he would give them credit?
That happened a lot, actually, especially during the Farm Aid, that to try to do a collection agency or have, to collect, it would be like getting blood from a turnip. The money was not there. And so a lot of things were bartered in trade. Instead of paying the bill, we might get half a cow, and fill the freezer with beef, or someone might work it off, or a lot of debt was written off. That there was a period where every day a bankruptcy notice would come in the mail, and that debt was just written off. And so that it was for my dad more than my mother. So my dad really served farm, oil, light industry. It was touch and go. And one banker in particular, said, "Cope, don't be surprised one day if you come to the store and there's a padlock on the door." And it was, everyone talks about the good old days and they're nostalgic and how wonderful it was. It was not. I had a wonderful childhood and I love McPherson, but as you know, that it was not, there were times when it was not easy. Great question.
What year did you graduate from high school?
Just like a couple years ago. 1983. So the oil embargoes were 1979. The grain embargo was 1980, 81. So it was right in that farm aid era. And it's when you saw the economy kind of turn over. You saw small towns become ghost towns. It's when you saw agribusinesses buying up small farms. You saw a lot of consolidation in the farm economy. I think the small towns that survived are the ones that diversified into things beyond just agriculture. So I think it was a turning point in rural America.
Did your parents ever consider combining the two stores?
Never. So my father grew up in the Depression. He was born in 1926, and he was one of 8 children. And it was very, for them, they grew they ate what they grew, and they were poor, but they didn't know they were poor. My mother, however, it was rough, and she watched her mother die in a flood. She and her brother were separated and put in very, very difficult foster homes. It was very, very difficult, and my mother fled when she was probably 11 years old and raised herself. And I think that's why she said, "I want this store. It's my store. It's going to be independent. I'm going to have my own books." That the stores were truly independent, and that they did not share details of profits and losses. What are you stocking? What are your expenses? What are you going to price things at? They were truly separate. And part of it is that my mother was very independent, but I think it's because she raised herself, and if it failed, it's not because she didn't try, and she was going to do it herself.
Beth, tell them about your yardstick.
Oh, okay, hang on.
Which was the most successful?
That's a tough question to answer because they were such different stores. My mother was a better businesswoman. She did not extend credit very much. It was hard to for someone to open up a charge account there. She didn't really want to accept credit cards. That it was, she was much more rigorous about ordering, keeping inventory managed. My father was more of a dreamer and tried things. He was somewhat of a pushover, and I think people may have taken advantage of him in some ways, but they were also very different businesses. Okay, hang on, I'm going to show you something. Let me turn this off. Okay, can you hear me? I'll show this to you. Okay, so my mother had these promotional events, and she saw that as a way to build business because her business was discretionary income. It wasn't people who had to keep the farm going or who had to keep the oil wells pumping. It was people who were buying pots and pans and dishes, and so she would have these promotions. And her hardware supplier said they would send a skid of these promotional yardsticks that she could give away for her Bonanza Days. And so she had Bonanza Days, and her job was to stand by the front door and hand out these promotional yardsticks. And so we all had her duties. Happily, my duty was to hand out little cups of Mountain Dew. And believe me, I took advantage of my position. By the end of the day, I was buzzing on Mountain Dew. But so, like 10 minutes before 8 a.m., my mother slits open the box of these promotional yardsticks, and she pulls some out and sees it says B&G Pro Hardware, and then she flips it over and it says, "Your handy, helpful hardware man." And she was furious that no consideration was given that this is a woman-owned business and that she was standing by the front door to hand these out. And she went to the salesman based in Salina, who was there on hand, but it was a Salina-based business, so it's somebody that she knew very well, and said, "What is this? Your handy, helpful hardware man. This is my store. I built this and you know it." And he said, "Betty, just stand there and smile real pretty like." And that made her even more angry. But she handed them out anyway because she didn't want to waste the money. She didn't want to. And so it's a nice relic. It's a nice relic because to think that to even buy the store, my father signed the note because women couldn't get a loan on their own. So it's literally, it is a measure of how far women have come.
Have you ever thought why, as a young girl, that you worked on your dad's side rather than on your mother's side?
My dad paid better. He did. My dad paid better wages. I enjoyed working for my mother better. They were very different as business owners, and they were different as parents too. Would you agree with that? Yeah. John helped with inventory for many years at my dad's store. My dad's store, especially during harvest in the summer, you worked hard. That it was hot and you were running. You were trying to get people back in the field to cut their wheat. And so if something broke down, you were running to get those pieces and parts. And if somebody needed a 1/4x2 hex head cap screw and they needed 6 of them and my dad only had 5, you're running across the parking lot to Mom's store to get that lesson, running back and to make sure he had 6. My mother charged my father retail. She wouldn't even give him a break for that extra bowl, and at the end of the month he'd have to write her a check for anything that he got. So I enjoyed, and her pace was much slower, and so you would be at his store like running, and then you'd go to her store and open the door, and then you'd have to like slow down. And there was music playing, and you could only walk, and you had to, "May I help you?" And while the customer, they would just study, do I want this padlock or that padlock? And you just think, please let the earth open up and swallow me whole. Because you're just a kid and you're just thinking, could you please make up your mind? But it was a good lesson in business and how to run business, but also how to treat people. How do you treat people? So if you haven't, this book is the byproduct of a story that I wrote that ran in the Wall Street Journal. And so if you haven't read this story, I will tell you one of the most painful experiences of my life that I remember even today. And it is called The Day That Bethy Lost the Bank Bag. And so it happened when I was probably 12 years old. And my mother one morning asked me if I would take the bank bag to the bank. And it was all the checks and cash and receipts from the day before. So she, totaled it out. And I had a bike, and it had a rack on the back with the bungee cords. And I took the bag, and I had the bungee cords, and I wrapped it around there, and I rode my bike down the alley that ran behind my parents' stores right to Home State Bank, which was maybe 3 blocks away. And when I got to the bank, the bag was gone. It was gone. And I don't recall, I never stopped the bike. I never wobbled. There was the bank had just opened. There was no one in the alley. There was no tugging. I don't know what happened, but I turned around and I went up and down the alley, up and down, and I couldn't find the bag. And so I went back to my mother's store, and I went in the office, and I was crying, choking, crying, where I couldn't form words. And my mother didn't know what happened. And I couldn't get the words out. And she's like, Bethy, you have to tell me what is wrong, what's the matter? And finally, I was able to get out the words, I've lost the bank bag. And my mother called next door to my father's store to say Bethy lost the bank bag. And they both left their stores, and they walked up and down that alley, and they never found it. And it was never turned into the bank. And I don't know what happened, and I was actually afraid that they would think that my brother Ricky by that time ran with kind of a rough crowd and was always kind of on the make, and I was afraid that my mother would think that I had taken the money. That was my biggest fear. And when I couldn't form words, I was saying, I'm not Ricky. I'm not Ricky, please. I hope you know. And then the next month, people started coming into the store to say, Betty, I noticed I've got my statement, and my check didn't clear. And my mom would tell each one, well, Bethy lost the bank bag. And every single person wrote my mother a new check. Yeah, it was a small town. But to this day, I don't know what happened to this bag. I really don't think anyone stole it. I really don't know what happened. But fast forward, my husband had a small business himself. And there were a couple times when he said, hey, would you mind taking this to the bank? And paralysis, even handling money, it just is, it really makes me, it's upsetting. It really bothers me even today, that the thought of that it was a whole day's worth of receipts, and that to think that, it was awful, just awful. So.
I have 2 questions.
Boy, I like you. I like you so much. And also, Indiana's doing great in football. So,
That's
yeah,
right.
congratulations.
They're number 1.
Yes, number 2. But yes, yeah.
What made you think you could write a book, 1? And 2, did you have any challenges to get the book published?
Great, both great questions. Wow, it's as if I wrote him a letter and asked him which questions to ask. Okay, so I write for the Wall Street Journal, and my editor said, hey, I have a small business section coming up. Can you pitch me some stories? And I said, yes, absolutely. It's a topic that's very dear to my heart because my parents actually owned hardware stores. My mom had one and my dad had one. They were right next door to each other in Kansas. And he goes, I'm sorry, can you say that again? And I'm like, my parents had hardware stores and they were right next door to each other. And he goes, Beth, that's a story. And it hadn't really occurred to me. It didn't. And he goes, that's an amazing story, and you should write that. And it ran on the cover. And it got hundreds of emails and responses. And so I grew up with John. It didn't ever strike me as a novelty. And there's even a guy in Kansas who chronicles like the Charles Kuralt of Kansas, Larry Hatteberg. So Larry Hatteberg did a story about my father who had a museum. And I asked, when I wrote the book, I asked Larry Hatteberg, would you write a blurb for my, would you read my book and would you be willing to write, one of the, and he called me and said, Beth, had I known that your parents had these side by, I would have done a story on them. But I said, Larry, I had no idea that it was even halfway interesting. And he goes, yeah, so it just didn't seem that interesting or that it would be that interesting. But so the response was great enough. So then I was approached by an agent who represented one of the big 5 publishing houses. And it's very, very hard to get an agent. So I was lucky. And it's probably because I work for the Journal and not because I'm that great of a writer. And she said, I can get you published at one of the big 5. And I also have connections like with, if there were movie rights or if there were, international rights and I went to New York and whatever. So I filed a draft and I sent it to her and she said, oh no, this needs much more trauma. You need to add a lot more trauma if you want this to sell, if you want people to buy your book. And she started to add things to my manuscript. And so there's one anecdote where my mother had the registry for a big wedding that didn't take place, and the agent added to my transcript where my mother told us as children, none of you will have winter coats this year. And I'm like, what? And she wanted like lots of drugs and lots of sex, and she said, if you want this book to sell, you're going to have a lot more trauma. And I said, well, then that's not my story. Then that's, and she said, then none of the big publishing houses will want it. And so I asked to be released from the contract. So I broke the contract. And I went with I then pitched smaller publishing houses. And Flint Hills Publishing, they're here today. They're based in Topeka. And they are very selective who they take. And I'm grateful that they took a chance on me. And they have been amazing as far as on this journey, and they actually improved it. And I submitted my draft and they connected me with a great editor who made amazing suggestions. And 6 months and 10 pounds later, that I felt like a much better version of it came out, and it's because of the help with this publisher. Does that answer your question? Kind of? That answers your question? Yeah? Okay.
You said film rights, so when's the movie coming out?
It probably will not come out. When I broke that contract, I knew that this is not going to be a commercial. This is a labor of love, and that it will never be a New York Times bestseller. And that's okay. It's okay. That for it to be what she wanted it to be, it would have not been a true story. And that didn't seem like it didn't seem like it would be an honest thing to do. So, well.
What did you discover in writing about yourself?
So I'm giving everything away, but so my mother, the reason, most people want to know what happened to the stores. And my mother, when I was in college, she had been diagnosed with cancer. And one day she was in the store and a customer came in. It was late. She was almost at closing time, and a customer came in, and she stood up from her desk in the office, and her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't get her legs to take a step. And so she says, Warren, what do you need? And he goes, I need some wood screws. And she goes, you know where they are, just go ahead and get whatever you need and just leave the money on the counter. And so he did. He got what he needed and left the money on the counter. And my mom called my dad and said, you better come get me, I need help. And the next day they went to the doctor, and the cancer had spread all through her bones. And there was no way she could run a store at that point. It was just physically, it was just too much. And so she liquidated the store. And on her very last day in business, I sent her a dozen roses with a card that said, "Roses are red, tree bark is brown, the store may be gone, but the nut's still around." And her fixtures were donated to the Old Mill Museum in Lindsborg, Kansas. So I can go and see them, which is nice. But instead of Pyrex and hand tools, it has like prairie dogs and prairie chickens. So it's really interesting to see, what it's used for now. So what was the question?
Oh, what did you learn about
Now, what did I learn? I learned that she had a sickness, but I also learned more about my family members in doing so. And my sister had a mental illness that was undiagnosed, and that she was diagnosed as bipolar much, much later, and that was a sickness too, that had I known that as a child, I think her life would have been it would have been hard, but I think she was bullied a lot, and I think her childhood was very hard because you don't think about children in that era, children and mental illness, that instead of being treated, she was bullied. And that I hope people reading it are more sensitive to early diagnosis and childhood mental illness. Just knowing Karen, yeah.
What about Ricky?
Ricky, great question. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, and he lived a very fast life, and he had no insurance and no really access to health care. And he ran with a very rough crowd of like biker dudes, and those biker dudes escorted him to the other world. They got him. That last year was rough, that he had nothing to make things easier for him, and those guys took care of him in a loving and noble way. And I will always respect that. Funny story, in a way. When my brother was first diagnosed, he bought these little urns for his ashes because he wanted each of his buddies to have a little urn of his ashes. And he wrote on the side of the box the name of his friends who he wanted to have the ashes. So after he died, I had like this little celebration of life. And we had like the slideshow, but instead of like Muzak, it was like AC/DC and Molly Hatchet. It was like this heavy metal music. And the funeral home director hands me this box of these little urns of ashes and says, "Can you hand these out to his friends?" And I'm like, "Sure." And so I go to the front of the room and I pull out one of the urns and I go, "Weasel? Weasel?" And I realize, like, no one has a name. And it's like, "Goober? Goober?" And then these people would come up to me like, "I'm Goober." And like no one had a normal like name. They had these biker dude names. And it was the most bizarre experience of my life, to read these names off the box. But anyway, it was actually it was a nice moment.
What
So
about Karen?
Karen lives in Wichita. She lives independently, but is not in great health. She and John are the same age, but her quality of life is stable, but probably not great. And she has the heart of a lion. I tell her, "You are a lion," and that for people who have what she has to deal with, both mentally and physically, the fact that she perseveres, she is my hero. And that is she the easiest person to get along with, or is she the most pleasant person to be around? Absolutely not. but that the fact that she keeps pushing on and that she doesn't give up, she is my hero. And then my father, he, after my mom died, he kept the store for about another 7 or 8 years, and then he opened up a museum where he had hundreds and hundreds of relics that he had collected when he had his junkyard, and it was a museum, and people would come and look at things, but instead of things like phonographs, it would be like things like hog oilers, hog oilers and wrenches. Like it'd be like the wall of wrenches. So, but it was really impressive, and he was able to live on his own until he was about 95, and with the help of a caregiver, and it really. The last 6 months of his life were spent with skilled nursing, but really up until almost the end, he was able to live on his own with the help of a caregiver, and so I hope that bodes well for me. Yeah.
So what was their last name?
Copeland. Yeah. I went from Copeland to DeCarbo. I do like Copeland. Sometimes I get mail where they transpose the letters and it's addressed to Beth DeCarbo. Imagine that. Yeah, not great.
What was your connection to Larry Hatterberg?
I didn't have a connection other than he's just a journalist, and he had done that story on my dad. I can send a link to Lisa, and you can see it. It's about his museum. It's just like a 2-minute clip, but he did a segment on my dad, and so I reached out to him to say, you once did a segment on my father, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to read my book, and if you like it, write a review for my book, which he did. And later this week, Friday, I'm going to the Barnes & Noble in Wichita, and he wants to come, and so, which is really nice. He is the nicest person. And speaking of small business, he grew up in Winfield, Kansas, and his parents owned a bakery. And I thought, wow, to have parents who own a bakery, can you imagine that childhood?
A lot better than nuts and bolts.
Yeah, exactly. A little tastier than nuts and bolts.
Is he
Yeah.
still active?
He speaks to a lot of groups. He doesn't create those live segments, but he goes back and mines his video archives and will follow up, like, where are they now? And in fact he did that with my father's segment, and we'll re-air them on Cake TV.
So do you live here in Lawrence?
I live in South Carolina.
In South Carolina, okay.
Mm-hmm. So it's nice to be back in Lawrence. You live in a great city.
So do you write constantly, or is this just a...
I write for newspapers,
I see.
which is much easier than writing. This is definitely different muscles in your brain. I'd rather write for newspapers than
I
for...
love to read books by people that write for newspapers, because you say what you have to say in the least amount of words.
That is exactly right. That's exactly right. And that was my biggest problem. And that's where Flint Hills helped me, is he said, on my first draft, it was like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And he goes, you need to let the story unfold more and have recurring characters, and you need to, and that was hard. That was hard for me.
You went to KU for 2 years. Did you graduate then somewhere else?
No, I went, actually, I was on the 5-year plan. But part of it is that my mother she got sick and did her treatment in Hutchinson. And so I left school and I got an internship at the Hutch News so that I could go to her treatments with her and work, earn money so that I could live there and go to her treatments with her in Hutch.
You mentioned the first place you were writing and they wanted the feature story. Where was that?
I
heard you say the Journal, and
I was at the Wall
Street.
Street Journal. Mm-hmm.
That's where you wrote the sketch of
Yes, that's where I wrote the 2,000 word version. So if you're not much of a reader and you want the 2,000 word version, I can send you that. Yeah, and it's a lot cheaper. It's for the low price of free. Yeah.
It's kind of good to hear you because few of us ever thought we'd hear a book about nuts and bolts
Yeah.
that was published.
Yeah. It's hard to make hardware sexy. Yeah. Yeah. And when I say we're going to play a game called Name That Bolt, yeah, it's hard to get excited, huh? Yeah. Oh, I have prizes.
Well, no one named it.
Here.
Well, I admire the fact that you didn't make it sexy. Like, I think there's just a level of innocence involved with this that is just special.
Yeah. I don't know. Do people need more drama? Do they need more right now when the world is so... Do we need manufactured drama? And do we need to... I think right now people need just honest stories and how people maybe faced challenges and they got through it and it turned out okay. Like that. Okay, I'm going to give you these little ice tongs. Would you like these little ice tongs?
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. And would you like a little hammer?
Sure. Oh, thank you.
And would you like a little crescent wrench? I only have 6 of these, so I'm going to run out of people. And it really works, so screw on it a little bit.
Isn't that clever?
Isn't that cute?
Thank you.
Okay.
I thought we might get a yardstick.
No, that's the only one I have. Oh, I do have little. You can have some pliers.
Gift at the hardware store.
It
There
is.
used to be yardsticks.
It-
I have one that was probably 40 years old.
You can have a Kansas pennant.
I asked somebody.
You get nothing.
Nice.
You get nothing. I'm sorry. You're from McPherson. You're winners to begin with. Just
We got to know your
you got experience. The only thing about yardsticks is they don't stay square. You know what I mean? Yeah, they warp. But
I would guess everybody here pretty much is from small towns in Kansas.
so where's everyone from?
Newton.
Newton? No, yeah, of course I do. We all know where Newton is.
I'm from Parsons.
Parsons, yep.
Iola.
Iola.
Omaha.
Omaha. Not exactly a small town. Not exactly, but you can be one of us for the day.
Well, I am.
Russell.
Oh, Russell. So
I was
Bob,
married to a McPherson man,
you were. Who would we know his name?
Gene Smith. His father was the sheriff or police.
Okay. But you're from the home of Bob Dole,
Yes.
Russell, Kansas.
Yes.
Arlen Spector. I didn't.
Oh, yes.
Is
That's right.
He's from Russell.
Sublet, Western Kansas.
Western Kansas. Okay. Who did we meet earlier this week from Protection, Kansas? Have you ever heard of Protection, Kansas?
I have.
It was a new one to me.
Western Kansas.
Lisa?
Opposite. I am from Southern California,
Okay.
not small town.
Okay. Not from here.
Too many people.
I know. Go ahead.
I'm from Coolidge, Kansas.
Coolidge, Kansas.
If you've heard of National Lampoon's Vacation, that's where they stop and pick up the, that's where Cousin Eddie lives.
Yes, that's
In Coolidge, Kansas.
Did you know Tom King?
I had some neighbors, Dean King, and they had a moving and storage place, different Kings.
No, I think they lived on Elizabeth Street.
Oh, okay. That's a good memory because Elizabeth Street was very close to my street, Tom King.
Beth, what was the name of your parents' stores?
So my dad's was Copeland Supply, and my mom's was B&G Hardware. And so it originally it was Betty and Jean, but then pretty quickly after she opened it, she said it was Betty and God. Yeah. She said
Had a sense of humor like
she
you.
did. She did. She was my dad was very funny. My mother had a very dry wit, but she said, "I'm cutting him out of that entirely," and it was Betty and God.
Did you know Howard Berglund?
Of course, he was our pastor. In fact,
You married me.
You were married to Howard Berglund? No. And John, that was John's pastor too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a retired minister, so I knew Howard and Edith.
So at what church?
Well, just
Everywhere. Around everywhere, yeah.
Everywhere.
So he was probably the pastor when we when we were growing up. There was, yeah. Howard and Edith. Yeah.
His son Brad.
And his son Brad and Mark.
At our reading, he was in barter.
Is that right?
How did you get to the Wall Street Journal from KU?
Well, there were some stops along the way. Corpus Christi, and then Newsday, which is on Long Island. It's a newspaper on Long Island, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and then the Wall Street Journal. And so I'm meeting with a high school later this week, and my message to them is it was very intimidating when I started at the Journal because a lot of people there came from Ivies, and a lot came from the East Coast, and they came from money. And it was intimidating to go to the meetings because they're talking about derivative swaps and is the yen pegged to the dollar, and it was very intimidating. And I thought, I don't belong here. That, I'm just this, kid, a state school from Canada. I felt like I didn't belong. And in fact, I covered real estate, and one of the first stories I wrote was about real estate in Canada, like 1985 compared to 2008. And my editor goes, "You're talking loonies, right?" And I'm like, "Loonies?" And he goes, "Yeah, Canadian dollars." And I'm like, "Oh, that's right. Even though they're called dollars, there's a difference between US dollars and Canadian dollars." And I had forgotten to do the conversion from US dollars to Canadian dollars. And I'm like, "No, I'm not on loonies," which Canadian dollars are called loonies. And I said, "I did not, so let me go convert that." And he goes, and you converted for inflation." And I'm like, "Oh, no, I didn't," because I was talking about 1985 compared to today. So I needed to convert for $1985 compared to $2008. So I had to do that. And so I'm just feeling dumb, just dumb. And then he says to me, "Don't worry, we all did that." And he was right, and that it didn't matter that I was from Kansas or that I was from a small town or that I went to a state school. We're all idiots, and that somebody shows you. Somebody will just show you, and that eventually I had to show somebody else. And that once you realize that, and that is my message to these high school students, once you figure out that everybody's kind of making it up, everybody's kind of finding their way, and that then you're going to be okay, and don't be intimidated, and it's okay to say, "I don't know," or "show me how," or ask questions. It's, once you figure that out, then you're going to be okay, and don't let that hold you back. Then you can do things. And was I the smartest person in the room? Absolutely not. But that it is definitely the best job I've ever had in my life. And I think it's because I work with people who are smarter than I am. And it's great. That's a great position to be in.
Are you still there?
I freelance for them. When my dad got sick, there was no way I could handle both, getting him through a pretty difficult time and working in Manhattan. I had a 2-hour commute each way. And so 4 hours on a train and trying to work and take care of him, it was just too much. So it's nice. I get to write and pick and choose what I write about. And so and work who I want to work with. And so it's great. It's really great. All right, I'll tell you one more story. So when I was in college, I had an internship at the St. Petersburg Times, and it was privately owned. It was owned by a foundation at the time, and they had 45 interns, which is unthinkable today because newspapers are kind of dying. And so they put us on a bus, and they took us to all their different bureaus around Florida. so that we could meet the bureau chiefs and see what all the bureaus did. And on this bus, I'm meeting the other 44 interns who were from all over the country, just like myself. And I went to KU Journalism School, which I'd always been told was one of the top 10 journalism schools in the country, the William Allen White School of Journalism, right? And so you're meeting all these people on the bus, and it'd be like, where'd you go to school? And it's like, oh, I went to Indiana. You know, Indiana has one of the top 10 journalism schools in the country. And you're like, oh, wow. Where'd you go to school? I went to Florida. You know, Florida has one of the top 10 journalism schools. Where'd you go to school? I went to Duke. You know, Duke has one of the top 10 journal. And once you hear that like 15, 20 times, you realize, you know, statistically, this just isn't possible. And I will never, ever say that I went to the school with one of the top 10 journals, even if it's true or not true, I have no idea, but that it all came down to the work. And that there was a reporter who went to Appalachian State, and I could see her copy, and I could see what the guy from Duke was filing, and she was blowing him out of the water. And it's not that Appalachian State was necessarily a better school or that Duke was a better school. It made no difference. It all came down to the work. And the same was true at the Wall Street Journal, is that at the end of the day, it's the work you do, the quality, and how hard you're willing to do it, and not necessarily who's the smartest person in the room or who wears the nicest clothes or who has a trust fund, you know, that it was a good lesson. It was a good lesson for me. All right, I can stop talking now. And you can have cookies, and you can have cookies and coffee. So, okay, thank you again. Thank you very much.